Yvette, what time do you have?
I have 4:30 on the dot.
Council members, do you want to get started?
Sure. All right. Absolutely. I want to welcome everybody to the Fire Ad Hoc Ambulance Workshop. This is our second one. And we have Bobby Richards, as well as myself. And we have 4 ad hoc committee members that have worked hard to help take a look at our fire and ambulance situations. And we have longtime resident Bill Doolittle. I'm glad you made it today, Bill, who also has a house very near to Mission Trails, of course. We have Tim Toomey representing the CRA, Marianne Chickatants, a local whose house also borders Mission Trail and has an interest in the fire contract especially, and Molly Dottie, who has worked with and is currently working with FEMA, so she understands emergency services. So Paul's here today, along with Chip, and Chief Panholzer is here. I see we have an ambulance person, David Jednick. So today what we're going to do is take a look at some of the questions that people asked last time, and Paul Tomasi is going to address those questions. And then we're going to take a look at what improvements people would like to see from the fire contract and also from the ambulance services. All right, Paul?
Council member, if I may, before we start, certainly welcome and thanks for everyone for attending. Council member, it's important that I apologize. I felt that we had some profanity at the last meeting, and I jumped to the incorrect conclusion as you were speaking, Council member, and in an attempt to defend, I identified an incorrect party who used that profanity, and I apologize both to Mr. Maroney. I worked very closely with Mr. Maroney when we worked together here. So I apologize to him. I apologize to the council and the committee for identifying that. And I do want to conclude by saying that we have identified the party who used that profanity and have taken the appropriate disciplinary action. But I jumped to a conclusion, and I apologize to everyone for my reaction.
Thank you, Chip. All right, Paul, do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Council member. Thank you, Chip. Just this is a reminder to make sure you're muted. Welcome to the second Fire Ambulance Ad Hoc Committee meeting. The last one we had was last Tuesday, and this is the second public meeting we've had. Again, as Councilmember Tice mentioned, tonight's our opportunity to look at some of the questions and comments we received last week and kind of go through those a little bit as we work to develop the ad hoc goals moving forward. So tonight, we're going to go over those questions and comments, and then we're going to present the ad hoc goals that have already been developed and started, and then we'll open it up again to comments and discussion for the ad hoc and the public. So thank you everyone who's attending, and let's get this rolling. Yvette, can you pull up the presentation? And we can go to the next slide. That's the same slide as last time. And before we get started, I really just want to talk about, again, we want to go over what the role of the ad hoc is. The ad hoc is a group of 2 council members and community members who are put together to provide direction to council on fire contract language and explore potential improvements to the ambulance operation. We're aware from our last meeting, and I think most of the community is aware, that our current Monterey Fire contract expires June 30, 2022. So there's a time issue on this. Next slide, please. We'll start off quickly with the questions that came up last week. And the first question we got was, what are the changes being discussed to enhance services for the ambulance? And that's the whole genesis of the ad hoc. That's why we're here. we are looking at potential changes that the ad hoc will present to council for consideration. So that question was a little premature when it came up last week, but you'll see as we go through, based on conversations with the fire chief, myself, city administrator, Carmel ambulance employees, Carmel fire employees, and the comments from the public last week, the ad hoc has developed a set of goals moving forward. The next question we had that came up was that we need to consider the cost of services. And that'll come up a couple times tonight. But the first one that came up was the overtime on the ambulance. To present that, I want to look at the next slide. So if you can go to the next one. We want to look at what our ambulance overtime has looked like for the 10 years that we've staffed our own ambulance with our employees. And if you look at each year, you're talking about a 6-person operation. The first column is the overtime that Carmel employees have incurred or had. And then the Monterey backfill to fill vacancies on the ambulance is the next column. But the important two are the total overtime numbers that we've seen over the years. If you look at this chart, we have been fully staffed for 3 years in the past 10 years. During those 3 years, if you average those total overtime numbers, it is an average of $194,000 in overtime when we're fully staffed. Over the past 3 years, not 4 as was reported or made a comment last week, over the past 3 years, we've had a vacancy on the ambulance. In fact, it hasn't even been 3 years yet. We are working to fill that vacancy, and we have someone who should be completing backgrounds within the next week. But that vacancy happened as a result of a retirement in our operation and a subsequent nearly year-long negotiation to get the language for the job description correct. And then, as we all know, that every city had positions frozen and not filled during the pandemic for the past, 16 months. So we have had a vacancy on the ambulance, but I think every department has experienced at least one vacancy, if not more, over that same period of time. So the accuracy was right. It was $300,000 in overtime, but it's only been just almost 3 years of a vacancy. Next slide, please. A comment made last week was the goal in 2011, when the city was discussing having an ambulance and staffing it with their own personnel, was to retain 201 rights. Absolutely correct, 100% correct with that statement. And it's an important statement because if you don't understand 201 rights, 201 it's our right to have an ambulance. We want to have an ambulance in this city. That's not something that we want to have go away. And we're the only city in the county to have an ambulance. And if we give it up and we can't get it back. So maintaining that right is extremely important. The next comment was don't rush the decision. I don't think any decision's rushed, especially when you're looking at contract negotiations. There's a back and forth that takes place. But there's a couple things happening that precipitate the right timing. Not really a rush, but it's timing. Our contract expires June 30th of 2022. So we need to start negotiating contract language for fire services. You also have a public safety director that's retiring. So maybe the timing is right to look at the overall operations to look for a solution set. A question that was raised also last week was, what are the duplication efforts by both departments? And if you go to the next slide, we want to put this out. There's a lot of duplication efforts that happen. Particularly, our fire and ambulance personnel respond to all medical, fire, and hazmat situations in the city of Carmel-by-the-Sea. You're getting a fire engine and an ambulance on those calls. The fire engine and our ambulance both have trained firefighters that respond to calls. Carmel employs 6 firefighters that are trained as paramedics, and Monterey employs firefighters that can be trained as paramedics. Both cities, Monterey and Carmel, operate paramedic programs. That is our ability to operate as paramedics. That is our ability to have narcotics and issue them to patients with other things. But that's managed through the county EMS system. Both cities follow EMS policies and procedures. Both cities maintain their own paramedic equipment. Both do their own equipment inspections, and both handle their own supplies and equipment ordering, both actually out of the same company. So we have medical supplies that we order, and Monterey does the same. Some of the conflicting things that we have in the departments are the management of operations, and that's existed since we started in 2012. You have a firehouse that is being run by Monterey employees, and you have an ambulance service that's being run by Carmel employees. That is 2 different cities, 2 different policies and procedure manuals, 2 different operational manuals on scene management, operating out of the same building. And an important fact of that is the police chief, who's the director of public safety, is not stationed in the fire station. Neither is the fire chief or the assistant fire chief. So you have no direct oversight inside the building. To combat that, or to help with that, the Monterey contract involves a component of managing the ambulance operations. That's a year-to-year contract amendment that we put into the contract, and we pay Monterey to do that. And I'll talk about some of the problems associated with that as we move forward. It's limiting in scope. We also have backfilling the ambulance. So we backfill the ambulance with Monterey employees. Now you have 2 different city staff working on the same vehicle. That can cause some issues as well, because you have different policies and procedures, and you have management issues over the same vehicle. You also have competing unions. You have 2 different organizations, 2 different cities working out of the same fire station. So if a decision is made by Monterey Fire over their employees, it could be challenged by our union. They're under the same roof. Vice versa. If I make a decision over our ambulance employees, the Monterey union could question it. So those are just some of the initial duplication efforts that was asked from last week. Next slide. As we continue with the questions and discussion items, a comment came up that having the city have its own ambulance is beneficial. It's been called the Golden Goose. And I thought about this one, and that is a term that I've heard before, but the Golden Goose is actually the fact that we have a huge benefit by having our ambulance. It's an important asset to this city. It is essentially saying that we have proven that we can get you an ambulance to your door in 3 minutes. That's our Golden Goose. If we're relying on the county provider, those times are longer. So that, to me, is the Golden Goose, and I wanted to make a comment on that. Maintaining our ambulance is important. Another comment was to maintain services outside Carmel-by-the-Sea for area residents. That's absolutely critical. In 2013, when the city entered into a mutual aid agreement with the county to be the closest available ambulance to our neighboring residents, we did that because we wanted to get them medical care quickly. And we can get there sometimes quicker than the county. So we want to be that good partner, that responding agency. So that's an important component that came up last week. A comment came up to consider CAL FIRE and surrounding agencies in any decision you make. And the ad hoc recognizes that. We have stakeholders that are involved in any decision we make, not just CAL FIRE, but Carmel Regional, the county ambulance provider. So any decision that the ad hoc presents to council should take that into consideration. Then a comment came up that said, consider adding, and the comment was adding a 5th firefighter paramedic position to reduce overtime. But I think the intent was to add the 7th position because we are staffed with 6. So I wanted to take a closer look and just explain to the ad hoc a little bit about what that looks like. And so if you can go to the next slide, it's on that one. If we add a 7th Carmel firefighter paramedic position to reduce overtime, because that's what it could do, you're essentially adding an extra body to one of the 3 shifts. As I mentioned, hold on, we got the ambulance going by. They're giving us a toot. Oh, they went by already. Sorry, I don't know if you heard it. Adding a 7th position fills one of 3 shifts. As I mentioned last week, we have 2 paramedics that operate the ambulance, and they work 48-hour shifts. So if you put one on there, they're going to be tied to one of those 3 shifts. You can't just bounce around. It'll be too confusing, and you can just bounce somebody. If you think about just filling one shift, now you have one shift with 3 people and the other 2 with just 2. You would be eliminating overtime if you had a vacancy for one shift. That's 1/3 of the time that we occupy the ambulance. The total cost for adding a 7th position, when you look at a salary benefited position, is $165,000. The number I gave you earlier when we're fully staffed for overtime was an average of $194,000. 1/3 of that is roughly $65,000. So we're adding a cost for a 7th position of $165,000 to the contract while eliminating $65,000. So you're adding $100,000 to your overall expenses. And I hope that wasn't too confusing. Mary in the Pinecone wrote, I didn't go into marine biology because I was bad at math. It wasn't that I was bad at math, I was bad at calculus, which is much harder than math. So I think I got the math right there. Okay, next slide. As we continued, one of the big comments that came up was just to hire an ambulance director. This is obviously an option that the ad hoc can consider and present to council to do. To do this, the city would first need to create a position. It doesn't exist in our agency, so you'd have to do that. Like the other directors in the city, they would oversee the department, which is made up of 6 personnel. The city it would be an at-will position, and it would be salaried at 40 hours per week. If you look at what that would cost the city, a fully benefited firefighter paramedic is $165,000. If we add, say, 15% of that to come up with some type of salary and benefit number for a ambulance director, you're looking at roughly $190,000 for that position. To fill that position, you should also anticipate a 6-month to 1 year timeframe to fill it. We would have to create a job description. We would have to go out and recruit for the position and then go through the hiring process. 6 months would be very fast to do that. The current ambulance budget, as I mentioned last week, is $1.54 million. If you add that position, you're just adding an additional cost, but you're taking care of a management component. And so now your new number would roughly be $1.73 million for your ambulance. We had a couple email questions which didn't make it onto the slides, but they weren't even questions, they were comments that I want to address. One was this very comment to hire an ambulance director, which we covered. The other one was to replace the ambulance and to get a new ambulance, which is currently in the budget, and it's currently a project we're working on doing. So that's been taken care of. And then an option for the council to consider would be to continue the ambulance operation with city employees and no change. And that's obviously an option that could be presented to council. Next slide, please. So without any more discussion items or questions, we can go right into really the goals. But before we do that, we want to review a little bit this one slide from last week on the Monterey fire contract that we have. Again, the fire contract is over 80 pages long and has a whole lot of responsibilities and duties. And I'm not trying to make light of those with this statement, but the slide's only so big. The fire contract provides a response to all of our residents and businesses and anyone in need in Carmel-by-the-Sea to any fire, medical, or hazardous situation. It provides coverage on our ambulance during vacancies, which comes at an added cost, which we discussed earlier with the overtime slide. They also provide training, station management, equipment, maintenance, staffing, inspections, and administrative support for fire services. And as I mentioned, we pay an additional amount for some management of the ambulance operations. But again, a lot of that's redundant and overlapping. So that's an area that the ad hoc is looking at, is how do we reduce some of that? And the management component over the ambulance is also limiting, because we're asking Monterey city employees to manage Carmel city employees. And you have a lot of limitations in doing that. Again, they provide a fire engine on all of our medical calls. For that, the cost that we are budgeting for this year is $2.8 million. So let's get right into the fire goals that the ad hoc developed. And again, these are based on feedback from the fire chief, myself, city administration, fire staff, ambulance staff, and again, the comments or questions that came up last week. So the fire, and we didn't get a whole lot of questions or comments about the fire contract itself, but in developing these are the three main points that the ad hoc came up with. One is to increase public outreach on fire awareness and prevention. We know we live in a forest, we know we're in a drought, and we know we are at risk for fire danger. So how do we incorporate some component into the contract for Monterey to increase fire prevention and awareness? Two is, how do we work on the management options with the ambulance services? As I mentioned, it's a little bit limiting. And over the past 5 years, I have worked with Monterey to change the language, but again, it's limiting on what their scope is and what they can do. So what changes can we make? Three is to explore contract cost reductions. And that comes with any contract that you enter into. You should always, in my opinion, and I'm sure the ad hoc's opinion when they came up with this, is to look for ways to reduce the overall expense. And that was a question that came up, or a comment that came up last week as well. So let's look at each one of these three. The first one is the increased public outreach on fire awareness and prevention. Yvette, if you can hit the next slide, please. If we look at that, the first point would be to use and ideas that the staff and comments that we've come up with, is to use existing on-duty firefighters to conduct state-required commercial and multifamily occupancy private property inspections. Is that something Monterey Fire can do? Two would be to conduct annual exterior private property inspections for single-family residences and private property open space. Three would be to conduct semi-annual fuel load inspections of public lands, including Mission Trail Nature Preserve and Pescadero Canyon, and make recommendations for fuel load reductions. Four is to assist city in applying for fuel load reduction grants and manage contractors during reduction efforts. And then five would be lead education, outreach, and enforcement of beach fire rules and protocols. Again, these are all ideas that could be worked into the contract that the ad hoc thinks we can work in. Go ahead with the next slide then. So the next point was to manage management options with ambulance services. How do we manage we want to manage all aspects of the city's paramedic program. we have two paramedic programs in two different cities that run parallel to each other. Is there a way to align those two and have just one paramedic program? Identify areas where Monterey can expand upon an existing agreement to manage our ambulance services. Again, I've already talked about that. It's limiting in scope, but are there ways where we can expand on what Monterey provides us? And then 3 is to consider contracting ambulance services with Monterey Fire. It is an option. It's something that could be looked at by the ad hoc. Next slide. The third point was to explore contract cost reductions. And when we say that, you have to look at that each goal identified earlier so far presents either an added cost or a cost savings. For us to sit here tonight and say we're going to save X amount of dollars really isn't possible, because we're asking Monterey to do more services for us and to take on more responsibility. So as negotiations continue and we find maybe more ways to be more efficient or to get rid of redundancies, there might be cost saving in that, but there also might be added cost by what we're asking Monterey to do. But the important number we want to look at is that currently what we're budgeting for our fire and ambulance services is $4.3 million. That's the number the ad hoc is looking at. And through negotiations, is that a number that can change? Will it go up or will it go down? And those were the 3 items for the fire contract goals by the ad hoc. So we'll move on to the next slide, which is a review of ambulance operations. Again, this slide was in last week's presentation. And essentially, we're providing you 2 paramedics on all calls in the city, and they're responding to all fire and medical and hazardous situation calls. They're also trained firefighters, and they're managed by the police department, and then through contract Monterey Fire, and through the paramedic program, the county EMS. The cost is $1.54 million for this upcoming year. Let's get into the goals. So the ad hoc has identified, next slide please. The ad hoc has identified the following goals for ambulance operations. These will look a little bit different than the fire, because the fire is specifically talking about a contract, whereas this is more about operational goals. The first one is enhanced advanced life support, and that's paramedic services for Carmel-by-the-Sea. And what does that look like? The second one is maintain paramedic services in Carmel-by-the-Sea. As that came up last week, retaining our ambulance services is paramount, and the ad hoc recognizes that. 3 is improving management of the fire ambulance operations. I think I've touched on that a few times, and we'll get to that as we delve into these a little bit further. 4 is to improve paramedic services in Carmel-by-the-Sea without impacting existing contracts and agreements for services in surrounding jurisdictions. Any decision that the ad hoc makes, they don't want an outside organization or an agreement to have an impact. We don't want to impact other people. And then, just like the fire contract, what are some potential cost savings that we could achieve, possibly, for our ambulance services? So let's go into each one of these specifically. And if you go to the next slide, it touches on the enhanced life support or paramedic response in our city. Can you go back one more? That we skipped over it. Enhanced advanced life support paramedic services in Carmel-by-the-Sea. The ad hoc is interested in improving our paramedic response in Carmel-by-the-Sea. As I touched on last week, 62 people last year in Carmel-by-the-Sea had a response provided by AMR. That's out of 383 calls for service. And I was actually corrected by one of our audience members that number is not even correct, 62, because we also have mutual aid agreements with Carmel Regional Fire, which provides ambulance services into our city as well. So that 62 number is just AMR. It's probably higher. We don't know how many times Carmel Regional responded when we were unavailable. But how do we improve that number to ensure that those 62 people got a paramedic service to their door in that 3-minute response time, instead of having to wait for AMR, which we know is a slower response? Next slide. As mentioned, maintain paramedic services in Carmel. 201 rights. The ad hoc recognized that retention of the city's ability to operate an ambulance is paramount. Once we give up that right or that obligation to have an ambulance, and we tell the county in writing that we don't want to have an ambulance anymore, we want to use the county services for ambulance transports, we can't go back later and say we want it. So that's an important decision. That's not something that the ad hoc in their discussions want to even address. We want to maintain that right. And then any changes, I'm sorry, that I already covered. Any changes need to take maintaining 201 rights into consideration. Next slide. Improving management of the fire ambulance operations. How can we, as an ad hoc, and I'm speaking for the ad hoc, reduce redundancies, any conflicts that are arising between two cities working together, providing the same services, and how can we improve efficiencies between the operations? We have a lot of redundancies. How can we do that? That's what the ad hoc is questioning and looking into. And then, like I had in the fire slide, is it time to consider contracting ambulance services with Monterey Fire? Would that reduce some of those redundancies? Would there be a cost saving in that? And does that make sense? Next slide. Improve paramedic services in Carmel-by-the-Sea without impacting existing contracts and agreements for services in surrounding jurisdictions. This is a comment that we addressed earlier and came up last week. We are surrounded by stakeholders that have a vested interest in how we provide our services. We don't want to do anything, the ad hoc, to impact those relationships. We have a great relationship with CAL FIRE. We have a great relationship with Monterey County Regional Fire. We are part of the county deployment of ambulances through a mutual aid agreement. We have a lot of residents outside our community that depend on us to be the fastest responding ambulance, and we don't want to jeopardize that. The ad hoc is not interested in doing that. So any agreement they make is maintaining those agreements and those relationships that we have, because being a good partner is important. And then the last point, which was point 5, is, next slide, is looking at, that's the next slide, is looking at potential cost savings for our ambulance services. Just like the fire contract, the language is the same. Each goal identified that we would look at could present either a cost increase or a cost saving. So the ad hoc is being conscientious of that. So any decision they make will look at what the overall cost is for services. And again, our overall cost for services for fire and ambulance, the number we're looking at, or they're looking at, is $4.3 million. Is that a number that can come down? And that's what the ambulance is looking at. That's what council has tasked. All of these goals are what council has tasked this ad hoc committee with. How do we improve services? How do we retain services? And how do we look at the bottom dollar sometimes, which is cost? With that, I will conclude the presentation, and I'm going to turn it back over to Councilmember Tice for any questions, comments for the ad hoc, or if you want to open it up to the public to gain some more feedback on this.
Thank you, Paul. Yvette, can you go back to the screen of a participant so I can see if anybody's raised their hand? And we can always go back to the slides if people have questions. So thank you. All right, excellent. So does anybody have any questions at this time that we can address, or what after addressing questions, what I'd like to do is then let's just take a look at the fire contract and the items of that Paul mentioned. And if people have comments on those specific suggestions, we could take the discussion to that immediately. If I don't see anybody's hand up right now. Oh, Gerard, thank you. Nice to have you here. You're muted. Unmute.
Not used to having my voice not heard.
We totally understand that one. All right.
First of all, may I make a comment? I want to thank Chief Tomasi. He's obviously spent a lot of time thinking about what needs to be done, and his comments have been, I thought, very incisive, and the details terrific. Most people don't know me, so let me tell you, I spent 10 years on Carmel's City Council. I was the head of the CRFA for 10 years, and then I was kept on for another year or two after that. I've also served as one of the city's city attorneys, and I represented another Monterey Peninsula city for several years as one of their city attorneys also. By way of background, let me say that the ambulance service in Carmel has a long and storied history. By the time I came on board, the police chief of Carmel was not the head of the CRFA. There was a committee that ran the CRFA, and the committee was made up of me as a city council member, and then there were others who also were members of that committee. There was a representative from Carmel Valley at that time, and there were other people that had expertise in ambulance services that were serving. And we ran our own service. And let me tell you that what our passion was. When I was on the CRFA, was as president and otherwise, the passion I had and the passion we had was to attack what we thought was a very inappropriate response time that was provided by the ambulance services around the Monterey Peninsula. I think, I'll cut to the chase. The average response time, including in Carmel, was anywhere from 8 to 12 minutes. Wow. And I thought that was totally unacceptable, especially in a city like Carmel-by-the-Sea, where the average age, I'm not allowed to give a number, but where the average age of our citizens is quite a bit older than most other cities in this area. And thanks to the efforts of our committee that oversaw the CRFA, we got the response time in Carmel from 12 minutes to 10, and then 9, and then gradually 8. And eventually we got down to around 2 to 3 minutes. And I have friends who are physicians who tell me the difference between a response time of 8 to 10 and 2 minutes or 3 minutes frequently means the difference between life and death. When I was on the city council, I can't even tell you how many times we had people who would show up, some of them physicians, who would say, the reason I'm even alive now is because you got to us so quickly that it made a difference between life and death. And as I've told Chief Tomasi, and I told Chip Rarick even recently, was, that's what our goal should be. Because we have a unique population, we need to make our response time as low as humanly possible. And we did that, again, without being headed by somebody as able as Chief Tomasi. We had a group consisting, again, I'll say it, one city council person, me, and other people who had expertise in the area of the delivery of ambulance services. We were one of the first ambulances in the entire county that had 12 lead cardiac availability in our ambulances. And we were the ones who spec'd out we who had expertise in this area, and I don't include myself. I was just a voyeur, but We managed to spec out the ambulances that we needed, the improvements to the ambulances we needed, to work on communications with CHOMP to get on-time, real life responses to the patients that we treated. And remember, fire, of course, is very important. I'm not trying to undersell the importance of our fire trucks and our fire employees, because after all, I can tell you 2 weeks ago, I was in an airplane flying over Carmel, and it was very disheartening to look down and see that our once green city is now brown. One fire, one stupid kid with a cigarette could end many lives. So having a fire response, even if it's only 5 or 6, a handful a year, is important. But the ambulance service, which delivers probably an average, the last time I looked, an ambulance of at least one recovery a day, that should be our focus. Again, I'm not downplaying the fire aspect, but this ambulance aspect is so important. And the question is, what are the alternatives that make sense? Now, one alternative, and I know I'm speaking well beyond my allotted time, but one alternative is to go back to what we had back in the Perry Newberry days, where we didn't have ambulances. Another possibility, of course, is to go back to the volunteer period. Another possibility would be to go with CAL FIRE. We looked at that at one time. And then there was the way we did it, which was to first have our own service and then eventually bring in Monterey as a trainer. And that seemed to work very well for the last few years. I'm not sure it worked as well as the system we had, but the other alternative, the final alternative, is just to turn everything over to Monterey. Now, the last alternative might make sense if it made human sense, and it might make sense if it made not only human sense but fiscal sense. And I'll defer to Chief Tomasi. He's much more conversant with the fiscal situation than I am. But as I told Chip Rarick recently, and as I told Chief Tomasi, to me, the golden goose, if I can use Chief Tomasi's term, really is, can we keep, with Monterey, can we keep our 2-minute or 3-minute response time? Because without it, I don't care if it costs an extra $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000. Our people are worth more than that. It's not just a question of, is grandma going to die? It's, are we going to die? Because unfortunately, we are now grandma and grandpa. So what I would ask the ad hoc committee to do, and what I would ask Chief Tomasi, who I have again enormous respect for, and as well as Chip Rarick, what I would ask for is, please take a look at the model that we had when I was on the CRFA. Please look at that again, where, I'm not sure it's even fair to somebody like Chief Tomasi. He's done a great job, but it's not really fair to task him with running an ambulance authority. It just isn't. And nobody wants to hire somebody to come in and pay them $175,000 a year to run our ambulance authority. But we've done it, in an alternative way that actually made sense and didn't cost anything extra. We had people who were on the city council like me, and we had volunteers from surrounding and related ambulance services, giving us input and protecting our 201 rights. And I agree with Chief Tomasi. Those 201 rights are just huge. And it would be, I think, a great loss to give those up. So I've probably I know I've overstepped my time and my right to speak. But I would suggest that, especially Bobby Richards, who I know extremely well as you, Carrie, take a look at some of the other models that we've looked at. I mean, at the end of the day, maybe Monterey makes sense, but there are other models that we can look at, and I would just ask the ad hoc committee to please look at those. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gerard. We appreciate that historical perspective, and I think it's important for the ad hoc committee to understand how the ambulance was run and how it was formed when you were overseeing it. So no, that's really good information. And taking a look at those other models is something that we can definitely do. So thank you. And the ad hoc had wanted to talk to you, so I'm so glad you're here today. Thanks, Gerard. Good timing. Timing is everything. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Councilmember, when we're done with comments, it's nice to see Councilmember Rose, and since he wasn't at last week's meeting, if I could have 90 seconds to respond, because I think that the ad hoc committee has some answers for some of the issues that questions and points that he brought up, and others. I mean, they're all very, very valuable, but just so we get on the record, and I can reiterate some of the things we talked about last week and in our prior meetings, Councilmember, whenever you're ready for me.
Yeah, I think now's good timing, Chip, if you'd like.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. And again, thank you, Councilmember Rose. Really good perspective. And for everyone's background, the committee met several times to look at the history and the relationships, because this does go back. And actually, we had Paramedic Jednick, who came, and of course he was a firefighter paramedic with CRFA, so he provided just an incredible amount of history. One of the goals that we want to reiterate is that we're looking at service enhancements. So Councilmember Rose talked about better coverage. The city of Monterey provides, they now provide, for everyone's benefit who wasn't on the call last week, since for the last 3 years, next month, the city of Monterey has a paramedic program, and Chief Tomasi and I have worked together closely for several years in my current manifestation, and then in the city of Monterey. And I can tell you, because I was there when we recruited for him, one of the objectives that the city manager in Monterey had for Chief Panholzer was to stand up a paramedic program. Chief Panholzer is a paramedic, and of course he's a local. He's a local guy. Worked in the Highlands, worked locally and in San Jose for a lot of his career. But he's done an amazing job at standing up. And the city of Monterey recently has agreed that Monterey will have a permanent paramedic program. He worked tirelessly with Monterey County to allow the city of Monterey to establish a paramedicine program, and is doing great. And again, we can ask Chief Panholzer, but he's got well over a dozen paramedic firefighters now. And if you talk to him, eventually his service will be, every firefighter will be at that higher ALS level of paramedicine. So better coverage with having a paramedic on a fire engine within our village, responding to all calls, is an objective of the ad hoc group, and an objective, I believe, of the council. And again, Monterey always meets that 3-minute response time that we have in our contract, in our agreement. And that gets into what Mr. Rose said as well about whether it makes human sense, whether there's an opportunity again to enhance service for our residents, and quite frankly for the Councilmember Rose, the people who live right outside the city, by a couple of feet, and we respond to them on the point in Carmel Woods, et cetera. We'll certainly look at that CRFA model. I think that's a really good beta. And the last thing I want to add is the 201 rights. Our right to transport is sacrosanct in the council's mind, in our mind administratively, and in the ad hoc's mind. So maintaining that right to transport. Now again, the 201s, they don't care what patch is on the shoulder, who's driving the ambulance, but it's certainly been everyone's starting point that we're going to maintain the ambulance service in the village. So that has been very, very, it's non-negotiable. We're going to continue to do it. Who drives that ambulance, and what employees drive that ambulance, and who rides on a fire engine remain things that we're going to talk about. And again, we're not at negotiations yet with City of Monterey. the ad hoc group will meet and make recommendations to the council that Paul and I will be taking to them in October. So thank you for the time, council member. And again, thank you, Mr. Rose, for your comments, sir.
That Paul, Tomasi, Chief, do you have anything to add to Gerard Rose's and Chip's comments?
No, I just want to thank Gerard for joining us and providing that bit of history. I thought it was great, and I think Chip covered it very well. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any other hands being waved at me here or up? I don't see any. So I'm wondering if we could go to the fire contract considerations and make sure that we get any comments from the public. And as Paul had said, we're looking to increase public outreach on fire awareness and prevention. I know that from a city council perspective, I've heard from several of our citizens about their concern, as Gerard said, for the brownness of our city and how we can manage that. So that's one thing that the ad hoc committee does want to address. The management options with ambulance service and the potential cost reductions for service are the main goals that were mentioned, right, Paul?
Yes, you're correct.
So does anybody in the public have anything else that we should also consider? I know, Bobby, do you want to speak to this a little bit? Because this was one of your big concerns as well.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Well, I guess my real question was, or would be to Chief Panholzer, do these things look reasonable to you as we go through these goals? Do you think that they're within reason?
Without initiating any contract negotiations, yes, they're all items that we can certainly have conversations about. Most of them don't look like they would have any major cost impacts one way or another. And some of the things were actually things that we already do provide, and maybe we just need to do a better job of awareness, and certainly we can do that.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Carrie. But no, I'm fine. I think the chief laid it out very well.
Chief Panholzer, can you explain to people, because recently you just had a position that is more public outreach, and I don't think people are aware of that. Do you want to take this opportunity to kind of do a little PR here?
So, yeah, when I first got here, as Chip mentioned, one of my assigned goals was to put to bed the idea of a paramedic program in the Monterey Fire Department. Either say no, it's not a worthwhile cause, or get it implemented. And we went down the second path there. But one of my personal goals was I realized that our fire prevention division was not adequately staffed, and it's been my goal since day one to increase the staffing level and bring some more expertise in on that level, in that part of the program. Unfortunately, blame it on COVID, like everything else these days. I did get a second position added, and shortly after I filled it, I had somebody else leave, and then due to budget cuts here in Monterey, we had to freeze the position. But my goal is hopefully by the middle of this fiscal year to go back to the council with a mid-year budget add to get that position reestablished and get a second person hired in the fire prevention division. And part of the reason was one of my concerns was to do a better job in the wildland fire prevention and education and outreach piece of what we do, because that's certainly over the last several years has become an even greater concern, considering what the wildfire seasons are in the state of California, as well as our local drought and as was pointed out, the sad state of affairs of our urban forests and the need to help maintain them and to keep ourselves safe living in them. So that was one of my priorities. It still remains a priority to finally get to close the loop completely on that. And I have every intention of fighting for that.
Great, thank you. So that's a position that you now added a second one. So I think you're hearing what some of the fears people have with the fire prevention aspect of your outreach. So thank you. Does anybody else have any comments in regards? Do you think that the ad hoc and what Paul Tomasi has stated in terms of our goals for the fire contract, is there anything anybody'd like to add or enhance? So we're looking for that. And if nothing comes to mind now, once again, you can always write the city clerk and make mention of those things, and we'll at our next meeting we'll incorporate them into our discussion. Okay, I don't see anybody's hands up. All right, so let's go. It looks like we've covered the concerns that people have had for the fire contract. So let's go over to the ambulance goals, and let's talk about ambulance services for, and those goals included enhanced advanced life support. Of course, maintaining our 201 rights. We want to still keep our ambulance in Carmel at that fire station. Improving management of fire ambulance operations and improve paramedic services in Carmel-by-the-Sea without impacting existing contracts and agreements for services in our surrounding jurisdictions, and any potential cost savings for ambulance. Would anybody like to make a comment on these or have any questions that the chiefs could answer? Looking for input there. Gerard? You're muted.
Okay, at the risk of way overstating my comments, the first thing I would like to see is we need to recruit women, okay? It hasn't gone unnoticed by anybody who thinks about it that we need to specifically recruit women for that service, okay? Secondly, whatever choice we make for our ambulance drivers and employees, we need to assure them that whatever deal we make with Monterey or God help me, CAL FIRE, we protect their rights and their seniority. Third, whatever we do, I think it would be really smart if we took appropriate steps to keep locals local. There are people here who understand Carmel's weird address and contact information. Like it or not, there are people in our fire and ambulance authority employment who understand how we operate and where we operate and know the city and know its residents. So those are my 3 comments.
Okay. There's Gerard. So recruit women was one issue. Protect the rights and of if the recommendation is for Monterey to take over the ambulance, be sure to protect the rights and the benefits of ambulance, and then make sure that to focus on keeping the local ambulance people that are familiar with Carmel in Carmel. Is that correct, Gerard?
Yeah, that's correct, Jerry.
Okay. My internet was going out in and out a little bit, so I wanted to make sure I captured that in my notes. So thank you. Carolyn, you had your hand up. Would you like to say anything?
I do. Thank you, Carrie. I have a multitude of thoughts. I'm not sure how I can organize them here, but with regard to management of the ambulance, back when we merged with Monterey and George Rawson was our police chief, with the merger, we no longer had a fire chief for ourselves. And so the public safety director position was created that George Rawson filled, which now Chief Tomasi also is our public service director. But it would make sense with Paul's retirement, negotiating the contract with Monterey for fire services going into the forward, that it makes sense to have a Monterey fire chief oversee the staffing of our ambulance and our fire truck. And if we go back some more history, our paramedics at one time were just paramedics, but then they were cross-trained to be paramedic firefighters, so we could address the 2 in and 2 out rule or the guideline. And then through that union negotiating with the city, they wanted to become firefighters first, paramedics second. So it also segues right into being able to integrate them into the Monterey Fire Department if Monterey is so inclined. Perfect sense to integrate them into the firefighters over in Monterey. And what it does for Monterey is it increases the bench depth for their paramedics. And I think it's one way of reducing overtime. You have more paramedics to pull from. And nobody's talked about the benefits for these employees. And if you want to be altruistic about it, you can look at if they become Monterey employees and Monterey staffs our ambulance that's based at our firehouse, those employees have broadened their opportunities for advancement, opportunities for other types of work in the field. And for the way I see things right now, it's kind of a dead-end job just to be riding an ambulance all the time. And if they were part of the Monterey Fire Department, it makes sense that they could be doing other things. They could even be working towards advancements. And I think it would help with retention and recruitment issues that all departments are having right now. And I think it would just benefit not only Monterey, but it seems like that solution of having those employees become Monterey employees and staff our Carmel ambulance is a way to simplify a lot of your management and oversight issues with the contracts and the duplication of efforts. It just simplifies a lot of things. And, when you think about if you go to Transparent California and look at salaries of our paramedics, and I think the latest year you could tap into it would be 2019, you could see that our top paramedics are making $220,000, $214,000. If you have a broader base of paramedics, you won't be having them put in quite as much overtime. And I still think that there's some savings to be realized in management. And the idea of creating an ambulance director to manage 5 employees does not make any sense. That does not make any sense. You're creating a position that to oversee only 5 employees is not cost effective in my mind. But I do think that doing away with public service director and just so our future police chief has just the concerns of the police department to worry about, and let Chief Panholzer oversee the staffing of ambulance and fire in one station. And I'm still on board for that. I think it just also means that our administrators have one less union to have to negotiate with. And I'm sure that the administrator and the city council would appreciate that too. So that's my comment for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn. Molly, you had your hand up, but it seems to have disappeared. So
It disappeared because I think
so those
Carolyn,
were
it disappeared because
Carolyn took care of it for you. She beat you to
Carolyn
the
made
punch.
quite a few of the comments that I was going to make. I think pointing to some of the hidden cost savings, time savings that we're considering. But also, I just wanted to highlight one of the awarenesses I have gotten from these meetings, and that is the incredible value of some of our mutual aid agreements, which provides to the city of Carmel a lot of backup and a lot of contingencies that are addressed through our mutual aid agreements. That I think at least I, as a member of the general public, was not aware of previously. And I think it's a real value add for the residents of Carmel-by-the-Sea to have this kind of backup when we might need it and get into situations where we, for example, may need more than one ambulance or may need backup fire support and so forth. So I think that's one of the hidden benefits of some of these mutual aid agreements, but well, obviously with the city of Monterey, but also other areas as well. Over and out.
Thank you. Bobby, you had your hand up?
Yeah, well, thanks, Carrie. I was going to add on to what Gerard and Carolyn both said about the retention of the employees. And so this question, I guess, would go out to Chief Panholzer. Chief, how would that look if Monterey Fire was to oversee or take over the ambulance or paramedics? Would there be opportunity for them to promote? And would they be able to, if they wanted to stay in Carmel, would they be able to stay in Carmel?
So based on the process we went through in all of the various contract setups that we have, first with Pacific Grove, then with Carmel for the fire side, then with the airport for their fire services. In each of those transitions, there was a separate agreement that was worked out between both labor unions and both cities or jurisdictions. So it was a four-party agreement which addressed all those kinds of issues of how those people come across with seniority, how benefits translate through, what happens to their vacation balances that are currently, with one city and now and they brought all those things over. So we would go through a similar process of working out all those details to ensure that there is that nobody gets left hanging and that there's a fair and reasonable process to transfer all those kinds of things over. Currently, we have the 3 division chiefs, so that's the third highest position in this organization. There's myself, and then Assistant Chief Jim Courtney, and then we have 3 division chiefs. All three of those division chiefs actually came from one of those. 2 of them came from the Pacific Grove contract, and 1 of them came for the airport contract. That demonstrates, I think, pretty well that there's an opportunity for some pretty high-level promotions for people that come on board into the organization through these kinds of relationships. We would treat them just like we treat any of our other employees. We provide the same types of training, opportunity, et cetera. And if one of them wants to just stay on the ambulance in Carmel, that's certainly possible too. We use our employee assignment is done through a seniority bid system that's driven completely by the employees, subject to my approval. So employees choose where they would like to work, and that's where they can work. So if somebody wanted to remain assigned to the ambulance, that certainly would be a possibility. And if at some point way down the road in the future they've changed their mind, that's still an option as well.
Okay. Great, thank you, Chief. It was interesting. At one of our meetings, we had a young paramedic that I'm not sure how long he has been with our team, but it was interesting to see what his path looked like moving forward. And it seems like it was basically capped at paramedic.
Mr. Richards, and then thank you, Chief. We need to, this is a really healthy conversation. We need to be a little bit careful about getting into too many details prior to, with no disrespect intended at all, before we get direction from council. So thank you, Chief, for providing us with that historical background on how we merged in the past, and it may be a model for the future, but we'll have to get into that a little bit down the road. So thank you for letting me interrupt.
Thank you, Chip.
Well, one thing I want to go back to is the fact what Gerard said about what our response time was 10 years ago versus what it is now. So going from, 8 to 10, 12 minutes, and now we're down to 3 to 4. So, obviously the ad hoc committee wants to make sure that that continues. And the one thing nice about response times is you can build that in as a checkpoint or a monthly report item. And we do that now in our city council packet. We do list what the average response time is and the response time for every ambulance and fire response. So we can keep a really good overseeing of that number to make sure that if there's any changes that we don't veer off from focusing in on that great response time. Where we got the 4 to 5 minute response time is when an ambulance outside the city was responding. Is that correct, Paul?
That's correct. So we maintain a 3-minute response time for both our fire engine and our ambulance within the city. That's been fairly consistent for the 10 years of this contract. What we looked at last year was our response time by AMR coming into our city when we were unable to respond. And through that mutual aid, as we talk about, we're part of the county system. So when we go outside the city, they can move an ambulance closer to our city to respond. And they've done that. Last year, they had a response time of about 4.5 minutes into our community when needed. So we're looking at about 1.5 minutes difference in response times.
Thank you. Did any of the ad hoc members, would they like to, this has been really valuable. So did anybody, Bill or Marianne, would you like to make any comments or have any other questions for the public here?
Yeah, this is Bill. I have one question with respect
Hi,
to
Bill.
Yes, I have a question with respect to the rotation that might occur if we join with Monterey, with the ambulance people and periodically people coming over from Monterey. Would there be opportunities for them to sort of understand or learn about the uniqueness of the addresses in Carmel so they're up to speed when they come over here? I mean, that's an issue that it concerns a number of people. That you can't just bring somebody in unfamiliar with the uniqueness of Carmel. There has to be some sort of training for that or something. Or would that be the case?
Chief Panholzer?
Yeah, I think that Chief Panholzer
Having a business in Carmel, I could say that the firemen and their trucks visit me about once a month because I have a very unusually large structure for Carmel. So they make it a habit of coming and learning about my building and where the Hofstas house is located. But Chief Panholzer, do you want to kind of go into a little more detail on that?
I can, yes. So we currently rotate folks through the station on the fire side. One of the things we do every time we hire new people, we part of their first year of training, they have to work at every single station on our system, so they learn the uniqueness of that station and some of the characteristics. And in Carmel, one of the things that we really emphasize is the unique addressing system that you have to learn what force northwest of something means. So we do train our folks on that. We currently do have some of our personnel that are cleared to work on the ambulance. Before we let them work on the ambulance, we make them go through a whole training on not just on not just this Carmel features, but also the uniqueness of the vehicle and how to work on that particular ambulance. So we would do the same thing. We don't just throw people in and let them learn the ropes by trial and error. We ensure that everybody gets the training they need to be able to do the jobs that they do.
Thank you. Good question, Bill. Marianne, you're up.
I have a question. The 61 times to 67 times that an outside ambulance responded to a call in Carmel, I assume that those were the 67 times where we had a lag time for a minute and a half. And is that were there any incidences related to addresses, or is that just due to the fact that the ambulance was just stationed a little further away?
Thank you for that. We reported 62 incidents last year where AMR did respond into our city to handle a call. I don't have the data on whether they were unable to find an address or what the delay was. We just know that the response time, and I do have to make a correction. Thank you. I reported 4.5 minutes last year. I actually don't have that data. I'd have to research it and try to get it. Council had me reporting the response times. I believe it was 2019. And on those responses, we were averaging 4.5 minutes. So I don't have what the 62 looked like. I would have to go back to AMR and request that data from them. So I just want to make the record clear. I don't have a 4.5 minute for last year, but I can assume it based on the previous numbers from previous years. But if you want an exact number, I'd have to look.
So AMR must also then have some kind of a training, right? I mean, if there wasn't any, what I'm trying to get to, there is a lot of data available already with outside ambulances responding to our city because they've been doing that for the last 10 years. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of any incidences of somebody not finding a house?
Personally, no, I'm not.
Okay.
Anything else, Marianne?
No, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, Carolyn.
Thank you, Carrie. I remember back when we went through the merger, Andrew Miller, the fire chief of Monterey, assured Carmel that their firefighters would be trained in understanding and learning our streets and parts of the city. And they did a really good job of that, I thought. Took that first year and it made sure they were all aware of where they could drive, where they could go. And Chief Panholzer, you might tell us as a group what kind of equipment you now have. I mean, this is 10, 12 years later. What equipment is on the engines now that helps global positioning if there's some kind of equipment? They're not just relying on strictly street names and signposts. There's less of a concern now on my part of the way the fire and the ambulance people get around because of years of doing this now. But you might expand a little on what kind of equipment is on the ambulance, not ambulance, but the engines and such that go out and find these locations. And we've been tracking ever since the merger of January 2012. Every month there's always a report of response times. They've been good all these years. There's rarely an off, call where it was something went really wrong. But so Chief, maybe you could answer that question about what kind of equipment helps you locate the call. Thank you.
So all of our engines are equipped with mobile data computers, which are connected to the computer-aided dispatch system. So it automatically, when a call comes in, although in Carmel it can be a little more dicey just because it's harder to geolocate anything in Carmel, based on rougher descriptions, but still we get a pretty good idea of where it is, and we see the maps. And it actually, like everybody has their little iDevice or whatever it is, it guides our folks there. I'm going to say, though, with a fairly high degree of confidence, because most of the people that work in the Carmel Fire Station have chosen to work there for longer periods of time. They know where they're going as soon as they hear the names of the streets and everything else. So my personal preference, still, good training and knowledge of the streets is very important, but we do have backup systems that help guide us to calls as well. So.
And Chief, all the fire trucks are now equipped with paramedic equipment, correct?
No, we have put into service 2 engine companies here in our Monterey stations that carry the required paramedic equipment. We have backup equipment. We actually have enough that we could easily put another 2 engines in service, but due to various reasons, including, that, like, we don't have an obligation in our contract with the city of Carmel currently to provide a paramedic on the engine, but we could if that were something that were to come out of the negotiations, as well as same is true for our Pacific Grove contract. They have chosen not to implement paramedic services there yet, but we do have it implemented, and we have the equipment available to put additional engines in service if necessary.
Oh, thank you for clarifying that. But I knew there was the potential there.
Yes.
All right. I'm looking to see if anybody else has any questions or comments or wants to add to this great discussion. Paul?
I'd just like to add on the dispatching to calls. The dispatch centers now are so advanced that if someone calls 911 from even a cell phone, it'll geolocate that phone so we can find them. It'll tell us, we have that in our own center, and I know county does as well. Whether it be a 911 or just a call from a cell phone, it will geolocate and show them on a map. So even if they're moving, it tracks their movement. So it's a really nice system, and it makes it a lot easier to respond to emergencies. That's a new system that just came out.
Yeah, technology has really advanced when it comes to locating people and devices. All right. Chip, any comments? I think we're going to be, looks like we might be wrapping things up. So any last comments here?
No, this has really been a great discussion. I think the 2-meeting format that we had really engendered more discussion this week than a little bit more than we had last week. And again, I wanted to reiterate that when that Monterey Fire rolls to all emergency medical calls, as well as our own ambulance. And again, as Chief Panels just said, I mean, we certainly have the possibility of contracting to have a paramedic respond on a fire engine to all emergency medical calls, as well as our ambulance. And again, so you're getting, I think it was Cindy Lloyd, everyone knows Cindy Lloyd. She was the head nurse at CHOMP, and she said, we went to a CRA meeting. Mr. Toomey was there. He sits on the board of the Carmel Residents Association. A paramedic can do almost as much in the field as can be done in an emergency room. And again, she was the head of nursing in the emergency room at CHOMP for many years. So again, it's just so important. It's such a great asset to have a paramedic responding to calls in the village, and to any call, obviously. And it's something that we're grateful for. We're grateful for our paramedics. We're grateful for paramedicine programs. So, and I just want to again thank everyone for coming. It's been a great discussion. I've taken pretty copious notes. I'm sure the chief has as well, and we're looking forward to the meeting with the ad hoc coming up that will make a recommendation to the full council.
Thanks, Chip. Paul, how are you feeling?
Yeah, a lot of notes, a lot of information, and I just want to thank everybody's input. I think, do you want to go over the next steps, council member?
Sure. So the next step is for the ad hoc committee to meet again and take all these comments and suggestions and come up with recommendations to for the council to discuss at our closed session in October. And so I took a lot of notes as well. I really appreciate the time, not only that the ad hoc have given us, but also the public in coming today and in our previous meeting to give us really food for thought on what our recommendations are going to be, and help us, also communicate what we have and what we want to improve on. I think that's really important to know, really, to have the response times for 1 little square mile, to have a fire and ambulance response times, and of course to have our police is really, we are very fortunate to be able to have that, and we want to continue with that. And I think that's what's really important about what we're hearing is our citizens, our residents value these emergency services that we have in our little town, and we want to keep it that way. So, but it also takes people like Chief Paul Tomasi and Chief Panholzer to look at what we have now. How can we improve it for the future? And I think that's part of the process improvement, what we're going through right now. So does anybody else have anything else? Bobby?
No, not at all. Well said, Carrie. And you ran a great meeting. Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody. My internet was kind of going in and out, so I was making sure, you know how technology goes sometimes. But thanks again. If there's no other comments, we're adjourning this meeting a little before 6. And I think it was very nice. I really, really appreciate everybody's time and comments. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.